Okay, so if I'm right, I think about 2 more videos ought to do it, and we'll have those videos go through how to actually write the report, and I'm not going to write the report like so that you can copy and paste, but kind of pseudo-write the report, and I'll explain what I mean in a minute. But I hope there's something that you've noticed by looking at that timer, is I've spent about 2 hours and I haven't even started the report. And this is me who wrote the program to make the code for this data, and I've also done, gosh, a couple dozen reports. Every now and then I have to do the analysis for a student to check their report and see that it's right. And I've also graded hundreds of these. So it takes me a couple hours to get to where I'm ready to start the report. You should plan accordingly for that much time. Okay, so where am I going to start? I think I want a really cool title, and notice this is what I mean by pseudo writing. I'm just going to write really cool title instead of writing one, because that way you're not going to just copy and paste what I do. And then I'm going to do an introduction. And if you're like me, I feel like I just need an introduction because it's hard for me to write a report without one. But later, I always go through and end up deleting the introduction, and then one of the last things I do is fix the introduction, which is not a bad writing technique. If you do the introduction last, sometimes you can put your best effort in, and what is a client going to read? The introduction, the conclusion, and if you get their interest, then they're going to go ahead and try to read the rest. And I was about to start off my next section by saying, let's put in the normal stuff about using R-squared and alpha level, but it occurs to me that's part of a lame introduction, so maybe I'll just lump it up there. Okay, there's intro. What do I want next? Okay, so for the methods section, I actually did some of these out of order. I said talk about the distribution of enemy deaths, and then I realized I need to talk about fixing the errors. So it's not unusual when you're writing this report to go back up and insert, like I just inserted this guy up here. When I talk about fixing the errors, I'm going to talk about each of the errors and why I decided to delete them. The stock value, for example, was negative, but I could have chosen to make it positive instead of just deleting it. In my particular case, I did just delete it, so that's what I need to explain. Also, there were a bunch of zeros, and I deleted them, and I did it with my code, I think I have it right up here, in one step, because I said stock greater than 0. The stock values of 0 also went away, but those were 2 different errors, and I took care of them in different ways. The first aid value was huge, and so I would mention what the value was and why I felt like that was an error and why I couldn't fix it, and so I deleted it. The last area in my code was that NA in the enemy data, and so I would need to explain why I deleted that row. Interestingly, when I was analyzing the civilian deaths, I could have used that row because the NA was only in the enemy data. I did choose just to delete that row, and you're allowed to choose that in this class, but it should at least be mentioned that I deleted it and why. Now, let's talk about the enemy death. I'm going to explain what range there is on deaths. I mean, they were in the thousands sometimes. What's the average? I'm 95% confident, and I have code to do that right here. So I can steal this number and put that in. Oh, it changed all my formatting. Really? How do I not change all my formatting? I'm going to throw in a picture because that looks really cool. I'm going to mention what that picture is and what it shows. You don't just put graphs in without some sort of explanation somewhere. And then for civilian deaths, we're going to do the same thing. So do I have to include a picture? The answer is no. I'm doing it because I like to do that, and that's my style. I hope as you write your final project that you look for your own style. How do you like to explain things? Are you leaning heavy on the pictures, or do you lean heavy on explaining things with words? And some people like to be funny, some people like to be serious. It's okay for you to find your style and make that work for you. Now, how did I pick that enemy model? Well, my enemy model had some polynomials, so I'm going to explain how I did those polynomials. And I want it to look nice, so I guess instead of caret notation, I'm going to do squared. That's not necessarily something I'm going to grade too harshly, because figuring that out is not necessarily easy, depending on how comfortable you are with Word or whatever program you're using. And logs are a special unique tool. There's specific outliers that make you think a log is a good idea. Some people, when they're doing this, they like show the residual plot. Here's what I saw before, here's what I saw after. That's very strong evidence that a log is useful in the model. That's also a style choice. You can just explain that you did it, or you can show it. I hope you feel proud of your final project enough that you would say, I'm going to use this to show other people, possibly when you're applying for a job. Here's the kind of analysis I can do. Something like this is very visually nice for them to see what you are doing. If that's your style, great. If it's not, you can do it in other ways. You don't have to have this. Now, my enemy model didn't have any interactions, not categorical and not numerical. Let's imagine the client is saying, okay, that's a tool I know is helpful. How come you didn't use that tool? Well, I'm going to mention I know about it. I looked for it. There just weren't any significant interactions. It wasn't helpful to the model, so I removed them. This is especially valuable for me as a teacher because I need to know that you understand what those interactions are and that you know how to look for them. And if it turns out your data doesn't have any, that's all right, but you've explained what you would have done had there been some. Now, at some point, the client deserves to hear you say, I know how to check that I have done this right, and I did check, and it is done right. So the residual plots look good, the variables have small p-values, I am now happy with my model. So now that I have my enemy model done, let's talk about the civilian. The big difference here for me was I had an interaction with spies and napalm. So I'm going to talk about how there was a pattern, and I tried that, and afterward I noticed how those residual plots were better, the p-values were significant, and so yes, that interaction is helpful and needed in my model. Now, in case you've forgotten, my civilian model had a p-value that was over 0.05. And claiming that I used 0.05 and then breaking that rule, that's kind of important. So I'm going to mention what my thoughts were on that. And in that case, I really thought the cubic term was going to help, and the residuals seemed to look better. I mean, obviously it wasn't enough for the p-value to say it was significant, but I decided to leave the cubic term in. And I don't necessarily care whether I agree with your decision on the final project. The fact that you made a decision and it was conscious and not accidental, that's the goal. So it's okay for you to decide to leave stuff in or take it out according to how you feel your model should be. And maybe even I'll throw in that residual plot for personnel. I should have fixed my axes, made them look nicer. But I'll throw that plot in so that they can see what I'm talking about and why it was that I wanted to fit this pattern and make it look a little more random. And if I'm going to do that with personnel, I probably certainly ought to do it with spies. That was one of the variables that I never really did get fixed very well, even though I tried. And your goal is not to hide problems from the client. It's to be very clear and transparent. I have these tools. I know how to use them. I used them well. Here is the best model I can do. And in case you're wondering, here's a problem that doesn't have an easy fix. So I'm going to talk about what's going on here. How much detail you go into there might be somewhat of a personal choice, but make sure the client knows you're aware of where the residuals went funny and that it's not an accident or something you didn't notice. Also, it's helpful for me as the teacher that you recognized it and that you tried to fix it as best you could. Okay, now it looks like I've spent almost an hour on this, and I haven't actually gotten to the good part, which is the results. This is where you actually answer the question for the client. I have had students in the past do this part, and that's what they turn in, without the results. And let me tell you, that is not okay, that is not passing. And you know, I think this is probably one of my least enjoyable parts. Oh, that's an E10 to the positive, oh man. Okay, so case in point, this just hurts trying to put all this stuff in. It's for bombs, but that prediction equation is going to be valuable. A client's going to want to see it. And here I was going along just fine, but that one is categorical. So this number really needs to be added to my intercept, which means I actually have two equations. And since it's not an interaction, it's just the term, the only thing that changes is that number, the y-intercept, is going to be different for the two. And you might be wondering how many decimal points you're required to use on this. I don't know that I care. This isn't a class about significant digits, but give yourself some digits. If you were doing the code for the prediction equation and you don't put enough digits on, it can affect your answer, especially since stock is big numbers, and when you cube it, you get really big numbers. So even though that looks like a tiny number, it's going to be big after I take stock cubed. So do make sure that you give it some digits, right? And these leading zeros don't count. I mean, you know, a couple of actual value digits. So, I don't know, 3 or 4 seems fine. I'm not going to grade that particularly. And here I hit the personnel squared version, which I thought maybe I should put personnel squared by personnel, but that's a style choice. I don't know that I'm going to be grading that. I'm going to do it because I think it looks good. And now I've forgotten how much I did on the other term, but I could fix that. Oh, good. Now I've got my prediction equations, except it looks like I chopped. Okay, so there's my fixed parentheses. Now, these were my prediction models for enemy deaths. I have this. You know what I just realized? I'm like halfway through trying to write this equation. I think I did that in my code already, right? Isn't that what this is? Can I just steal that and kind of make it work for me? Well, I'm certainly going to need to clean it up. The client's not going to want to read the R code. Now, there's a couple ways to do it. You saw that I was going to do e raised to the power. You could also do exp parentheses. That's considered safe math notation. Another thing people like to do is e to the, and then make it a superscript so that it looks like a thing. And that's all style choice. I don't care what you do as long as it's accurate and as long as you feel good about what you got. And one thing to know, in R, you would need to leave the negative on the last line. But in English, we like to see that negative sitting before the number that's negative. So that would be the proper way to write it for a client, even though that's not the way the R code wants you to go. Okay, yeah, that was easier than trying to retype it all. Now, I have different levels of terrorism, so I've got to use this equation and put these variables in for the other levels. And again, because I didn't have my categorical variable interacting with my numerical ones, none of the other effects are going to change. Just that y-intercept, and that's for terrorism medium. It turns out I actually messed up on the math on that number because I forgot the 3 was negative, and when terrorism is low. Okay, I hate that part. Now let's explain each of the variables. Enemy model. Let's start with stock. Oh, really? Are we going to start with stock? That's not an easy one. All right, maybe it's not so bad. I've got a picture for it. So enemy deaths increase until here, they decrease until there, and then they increase again. That's not a great explanation. I mean, this wording here could describe a lot of different relationships, but I included a picture, and the client could look at that and say, okay, now I totally get it. There's stock. Let's talk about bombs. And bombs being just linear, that was easy. As bombs goes up, we get 0.1648 more enemy deaths. That's actually pretty low. I think if you were to drop a whole lot of bombs, you would hope for more than a 16% return on that. You'd hope multiple deaths per bomb. Of course, I don't know, maybe I've just seen too many movies. Missiles, also linear. First aid is also linear. So those are all going to be easy. Spies as well. It's personnel, we already did stock, and log media that are going to be tricky. Okay, so I've talked about each of them in turn. I feel good about that. Personnel, I still need to do. Stock, I've already done, so I don't need them. Let's not include... How about log media next? That one looks easier. This is what I figured out with a 2% increase. It's a drop of 12. So I'm going to say how that affects it. It looks to me like the enemy must be watching the media. That's an obnoxious number of decimal points. How about that? All right, personnel's left. And I'm going to put a little note here talking about why I think media acts that way. Personnel, I'm noticing the drop there, and then the increase. Could there be a reason why? Well, I don't really know, but the fact that I would try to come up with some reason shows that I'm really thinking about what it means and trying to go through and give some detailed explanation, which is good. It's impressive to a client, and it shows me that you're thinking about what you're doing. So now I'm ready to start looking at the civilian model. It looks like stock was easy and spies wasn't. I think if I go back to my code, I recognize I was going to need these variables. Made some code here that went through the explanations. Can I just steal all this and let's see if I can put that in my paper and talk about it. So here for stock was the slope, and I put that in my code, and there was the number I got out, which I have to think about the scientific notation, but it's some super tiny percent. Wow, I just wasted a couple minutes trying to figure out where these numbers come from because they don't show up in the model. But I finally went back to my code and I found those were the values for terrorism, for how terrorism changes things. Which then reminds me, I'm not sure that I talked about up here in civilian the difference between the two IG-88 models. And just grabbing my calculator here, these two models are only different by 329. And this one's lower because it's a smaller number. So when IG-88 is installed, we have 329 fewer deaths. Or you can say it the other way. When IG-88 is not installed, then we'll have 329 more deaths. So IG-88 does not seem helpful. That's the sort of thing that if you just go through this report fast and you like only have an hour because you waited until the day it was due, that's the sort of mistake you can easily make. I need to talk about, in this civilian model, I need to talk about terrorism. What's the difference between high, medium, and low? So I've written out a paragraph, and I tell you what, I was constantly flipping back and forth. Okay, terrorism medium was 0.509. The default was high. Thus, okay, there we go. So this number here was 0.05, which is 0.5%. So that's a small amount, but it's a slightly bigger amount if it drops down to low. So we want terrorism low. Okay, that was a lot of work, but those are the kind of details that you're expected to be able to take care of as a statistician. Now, increasing media increases civilian deaths, so maybe the civilians are hoping to be on TV. That's a ridiculous answer, but the fact that I came up with any possible answer shows that I'm trying to think about the meaning and not just getting lost in these numbers. Now, here I'm ready to talk about firepower. Firepower was logged, so I'm going to talk about it as a percentage effect. And really, these percentage changes are small. The only one that really had a big one was the terrorism level, and maybe media coverage. The rest are all practically pretty tiny. Of course, having just said that, I mean, we're talking about civilian deaths that are like in the 20 range. Maybe if we were talking about thousands of deaths, then these percentages would have meaning. I mean, saving one life kind of matters. So now I'm wanting to describe how increasing spies drops civilian, and that drop is more for low levels and less for high levels. Napalm does that, but as I look at this, and I'm like, I'm not sure I really like that picture. I can do so much better. I'm gonna go like this to get that whole picture piece. Come on, where did it start? And then if I size this out, now I will get a very different looking picture. See, that looks so much better. That's the one I want. And stuff like this just shows that you're kind of taking that looks exactly the same. Really? Copy plot. Put that in. There we go. This shows I'm taking pride in my report. I actually want it to look nice. I need something like, you can see this in the picture below. Oh, good. If there's one for spies based on napalm, then I obviously need one for napalm based on spies. Can I... And so now I've explained the relationship of napalm. I'm going to make these bigger because I think they're really cool plots. And yeah, alright, so, good. There we have napalm and spies. I think there was one plot left. Yeah, let's not forget personnel. And this little flat range right here is interesting, right? Like it could have been sloping up, except it sloped up, went flat, and kept sloping up. So something about the jobs they give people when they have 29 to 32, those extra 3 or 4 personnel weren't that helpful for this range. But I don't know, I guess if I was in administration, I'd be interested in checking out what happens if we have 29 people or 32 people. Now, if I just leave my report here, it's really not a very good report because we've talked about all these effects, but a client's going to feel a little bit like you're machine gunning them with all sorts of little details. So I'm going to grab me a little post-it note here, and I'm going to write on there, what do I need for the enemy model? What stock price gives me lots of deaths? I want the stock price to either be this middle ground or something high. And that effect with stock was actually pretty high. Well, let me show you again. We're talking 0 to 1,000 more enemy deaths. So I gave stock 2 stars to say, yeah, this was a big deal. More bombs, but bombs was kind of not so much. More missiles and less first aid. Spies seemed to have a lot. It was, where was it? Spies, 55 per spy. Okay, that seems good. Less media. So if I were to sort these, which ones make a bigger deal? Spies and stock are big deals. Bombs is going to go down as being not such a big deal. And doing this, I also noticed, look at this, enemy deaths negative 10,000. That was terrible. How did I not even notice that? So I'm going to go back into my code here, and I'm going to give it a big number just to bump this up. And now that looks a lot better. Let's use that instead. How big effect is that? Yeah, I think I'll give it maybe 1 star. Now, some of this is kind of a judgment call as to how big is big enough to be a lot to matter. I mean, here we're talking 150 to 200, so 50 deaths. Well, maybe 1 star. I don't care whether I agree with your judgment call, just the idea that you've made a judgment call. Here I now know what it takes to get enemy deaths. And so now I'm going to have what might be the most important paragraph to the client, a little talk about here's the kind of war you want to do. Let's have stock in this range, more missiles, less first aid stations, and a general is going to be like, this is what we needed to hear. So now I've gone through and done the same for civilian. What things mattered the most? Well, the terrorism level seemed to have a big effect. I don't know that any of the others really had that huge of an effect, but some of these others had more effect than others. But there's how we have the fewest civilian deaths. You know, I was typing out the paragraph, but look at this. Personnel and spies combo. I think it really does matter. I might give that 2 stars. I think I'm gonna have to move that up, which means I'm gonna pause the video and rewrite that paragraph. So there we go. There's how to minimize civilian deaths. And now I'm ready to make myself a conclusion. A lot of students I've noticed like to do this in the conclusion, but whatever's in the conclusion should already have been in the report. And I think a sentence like this deserves to be in the report. So because I'm trying to flesh out a report, it's probably going to be a dumb conclusion at first. The first conclusion you write always is something about winning the war and future research that says, get more data and look closer at some of the variables you already have. So, all right, great. We've now got us a report. This is not the last video because we call this kind of report a rough draft. Let's polish it in the next one.